You are listening to the Black Music Scene podcast, a show where we explore the incredible journeys, challenges, and triumphs of Black orchestral musicians who've dedicated their lives to the craft, breaking barriers and defining what it means to be a virtuoso. We are here to celebrate and archive the awe-inspiring stories of our living legends in Black classical music. In today's episode, we are exploring the histories of Black voices of empowerment in music. And to help us navigate that exploration, we're joined by Dr. Fredara Hadley, a professor of ethnomusicology in the music history department at the Juilliard School. Here as well to help guide our exploration is Dr. Tammy Kernodle, a university distinguished professor of music at Miami University of Ohio, and a former president of the Society for American Music. What do we really mean when we talk about power in music? How have Black voices been uplifted in classical music through history? What are we unaware of, and how do we pick up where those who came before us left off? We're trying to gain a little bit more clarity. This is Black Music Scene, cultivating community, lifting our voices, and telling our stories. Welcome, welcome, welcome to another episode of the Black Music Scene podcast. My name is David Norville. For those who do not know me, I'm an novelist and also a podcast producer. I produce for Black Music Scene, as well as a few other shows for New York Public Radio. We're so excited to be here recording a live episode at the Inaugural Black Orchestral Network Summit 2023. We're just so overjoyed. And the other thing is about Black Music Scene, it is the mouthpiece of our organization, right? I keep saying anytime, like lifting our voices, cultivating community, right? And more importantly, really archiving the experiences of those who were worrying about accidentals and like rosin, and like making reeds and all of those things, at a time where our very own human life might have been in a more dangerous and precarious position, right? Thinking about those like maybe Booker Rhodes Jr., who started selling with Philadelphia Orchestral in 1968, the same year that Dr. King was assassinated. What might that have meant for him to be sitting in that audience and sort of sitting on that stage and playing that music, representing that background? There's really something about those voices of Black empowerment throughout history that have been showing up in classical music that I'd like to lean into during this episode. And to help me do that, I am joined by two esteemed, wonderful scholars and professors. Please help me and join me in welcoming Dr. Tammy Kernodle and Dr. Fredara Hadley. Please. So, Tammy, Fredara, welcome. Thanks so much for being here. So I just want to jump right in. I just want to jump right in and get right to it. And I want to plug into a conversation that three of us were having while we were prepping for the show, right? So we're delving into this history, Black voices of empowerment in classical music. And it's important to know what we're really talking about when we say that. Dr. Tammy, I remember during our prep, you mentioned this idea, this collective need to demythologize power in Black music, which I think is a fantastic place to start this exploration. I'm wondering, can you maybe set the stage for us a little bit and help us understand what you might have meant when you were saying that?
Well, first of all, I want to say it's a pleasure to be here in conversation with you and my esteemed soror and colleague, and to be here amongst you in this community of advocacy and activism. In our conversation about demystifying the power, that has been on my mind lately as a scholar, because I think sometimes we tend to think that we are charting revolutions, and what we are a part of is a continuum of activity that has surrounded music making, archiving, preserving, and documented. The power that I was speaking of is the power that we oftentimes give to certain narratives or frameworks within the concept of music making. We subscribe to a hierarchy that says that certain venues, certain aggregations, certain spaces, certain repertory is a marker of excellence and a marker of success. So what that has created are these lapses in the narrative as it relates to us as music makers. And so in demythologizing, we have to, in some ways, reframe our thinking about what Black music making has been in America in particular. And so I want to invoke what is a theoretical concept that historians now use called the long civil rights movement. That they no longer look at the civil rights movement as being a wave of activity that took place between the 1950s and 1980s. But they said that we should now look at that particular period as a part of a continuum, a wave, a framework of continuous work and activity surrounding social change, racial reconciliation, right? And so we need to think about that in terms of what we do. You know, demythologizing that this is a moment now. This was a moment 30 years ago. This was a moment 50 years ago. This was a moment 100 years ago. But to see ourselves within this continuum, this part of intellectual genealogies that we don't oftentimes talk about, but also sonic genealogies that we reverberate and we build upon. I don't know if you want to add to that, Marcy.
Amen. I often say to students that we should shift our assumptions. Assume that Black people were there. Assume that Black people were resisting. Assume that Black people were making music. Assume that Black people were building community. When we shift those assumptions, when I shifted those assumptions, I looked at the text, I heard the music, I could more clearly understand silences and absences. I could more clearly trace the lines of a long civil rights movement and it takes practice to do that. Because if we talk about, power or issues of white supremacy, part of that is to make it difficult for us to understand, when and where we enter and show up and all of those things. And so I think that's one of the most important things we can do in addressing your first point. Not taking the stance that what we're doing is revolutionary because it's being done for the first time. It's revolutionary because it's being done at all, given the odds. But there are people and places and pieces and instances that can inform what we're doing in the present and make it hopefully even more long-lasting and resilient.
Can I piggyback on that? It's real nuances. The infrastructures that have, in some ways, sustained this, when we look as historians at telling stories, we are oftentimes looking at the larger contexts, and that's what our written history has robbed us of. Our oral history has robbed us as well, because we don't take enough time sometimes to have the very vital conversations. I said that we tend to privilege a hierarchy of spaces and venues and repertory. And when you look at what has been this history, we have created our own infrastructures. We have created our own secondary canon. We have also cultivated our own repositories of music and preserved music, even when it was not published. And so that our music never ceased to stop being performed. I was asked recently to contribute to an upcoming volume on Florence Price. And I was asked to write about Florence Price's legacy in the 21st century. And my work was centered on demythologizing that this is a renaissance of Florence Price, because that assumes that Florence Price's music stopped being performed in 1953 when she died, and it didn't. That assumes that her orchestral music, which may not have been performed, was the only viable portions of her catalog. And so what I set about doing was to outline how churches, how Black colleges, how community organizations continue to advocate, to perform, and to preserve Florence Price's music. So that now, because all of these symphony orchestras have discovered her, that's their discovery. She was never lost. She was never lost. Margaret Bonds has never been lost. Francis Johnson has never been lost. All of these people who have shaped and defined what was Black music making from a classical aesthetic, they were never lost. They were lost only to that infrastructure and that hierarchy that we privilege. But that music has always had some life. And it is part of larger cultures of curation and preservation and conversation that has taken place over the course of the last 200 years.
I appreciate that, and yeah, proud of you. I really appreciate you guys really starting to map out not only the fact that this is not one bullet point, but a series of points through history that we can connect and say that, right, this is not necessarily a birth, but a resurgence or maybe a swelling and winging and things like that. For myself, I'm a very visual person, and it's kind of difficult to wrap my head around something that's mapped out in that way. And whether that can be to see or dare to imagine. And as it relates to the way power is manifest, especially in classical music or in Black classical spaces. I'm understanding there's an entire ecosystem of moving parts that go into how we're represented, how we can take up space, how we can make our art and things like that. Fredara, I'm going to talk to you for a second. And I understand that your core research considers how people of African descent use music genres to construct and maintain community. And I would like to know, in your opinion, what are the avenues of influence present in classical music? Like, it has to be more than just holding the position in an orchestra or being commissioned that grants us power and legitimacy. Help us understand as Black musicians, what's in our toolbox? What have our people, our Black orchestral musicians, used in the past to influence change and make impact and so on?
Sure. I'm going to take a little bit circuitous route to answer that question. It's important to understand when I decided to pursue a PhD in ethnomusicology, I may not have done that if my advisor had not been a Black woman named Portia Maltsby, right? Portia Maltsby, Melanie Burnham, Terry Kernodle, Guthrie Ramsey, all of these folks had direct hands in shaping any generation of Black music, this current generation of Black music scholars you see out here now, but definitely me. And that's important for a few different reasons. But one of them is that they demonstrated to me that my job is not to do research that reaffirms dominant narratives, right? That's not what they were training me to do, because there was more at stake than just getting a good job or getting tenure or being on panels, any of that. There was more at stake than that, right? And so that push to find, not new horizons, because they were already there, but to know how to see and hear, right? That came from scholars like Tammy and the people I mentioned before. That's really important to say, right? And who also, we stand on the shoulders of people like Eileen Souther and Samuel Floyd as well. And there's a really rich legacy of Black music scholarship, scholars and scholarships. But coming out of that, I realized early on that it was important for me to write about Black music and how it mattered in the lives of Black people, right? Because there's a way you can do this work that only affirms Black music after it's crossed over into the mainstream. So, like talking about a renaissance of Florence Price, right? Or talking about the genres that do well commercially or the artists who do well commercially. And what you lose is the Black community that created, sustained, nurtured, and still participate in this. We do this across genre. We do this in jazz, we do it in popular music, we do it in classical music. So when I came to how classical music really entered into my research was through my research on the composer Shirley Graham Du Bois, who, as far as we know, she's the first Black woman to compose and stage an opera with her opera Tom Tom in 1934. And in learning about her life, and I would go on with a colleague who's a historian, we would teach companion courses about her. When I was teaching at Oberlin Conservatory, we taught courses about her. We traveled to Ghana because she moved to Ghana with W.B. Du Bois, her second husband, and all of that to really understand who she was. But in doing this deep archival research, literally like going through folders and going to the archivist and asking questions, and how this woman was able to build this kind of career. She's a pianist and a composer. How she was able to put together the opera was like massive in terms of the people involved. It premiered to 25,000 people in Cleveland over the course of a weekend. Shout out to Cleveland. Shout out to Cleveland. But in looking at her and how she built her career, it was exactly what Tammy just said. It was this, yes, she goes to Oberlin as a non-traditional student in her late 20s after she's been married and divorced and has children. She lies about her age. She says her husband is dead because she knows because of the respectability politics of the institution, she would not have been admitted otherwise. But what is shaping her musicality and her performance opportunity? I go to Black newspapers, Pittsburgh Courier, Chicago Defender, and others, and that's when I learned it is churches who are bringing her into recitals. It's sororities. She was a member of the same sorority, the only sorority that one could be a member of, Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Hey, there's always at least one. Who were bringing her in chapters in Chicago, chapters in Detroit, to give lecture recitals in the 30s before and after the premiere of her opera. And so this, to me, certainly strongly evidences this idea that there is absolutely this Black classical ecosystem. When you mentioned Margaret Barnes and Florence Price, we know that they were a part of an incredibly fertile, rich Black classical music scene in Chicago. And so as you were giving your opening remarks, I remembered, I'm sure many of us were busy in 2020 after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And I wrote an essay for Juilliard about honoring Black classical music and all of this. And, my take on that was, yes, we should absolutely program more works by Black composers. We should rethink, what our pipelines look like coming into conservatories and music programs. We should absolutely do all of those things. But we should also think about our audiences, and as we do this, tap into the networks of Black classical music that already exist. And if we aren't doing that, as we think about programming and we think about diversity on lots of different levels, then we are missing it. Because those are the sustainers when there is no mainstream attention. Mother A&E Zion Church in Harlem, I went there once, and the pastor was telling me that the architecture of the church is the oldest Black church in New York State, was meant to evoke a slave ship, right, in the architecture of the church. But it was also designed to be a concert hall. That was built into the very intentions of this church. And so unless we're able to incorporate those histories and acknowledge who has been there when the New York Times isn't writing about Black classical composers and orchestral musicians. Remember that the Crisis magazine, all of these Black newspapers had music critics who certainly had the range to talk about the latest compositions, the latest concerts of Black composers. And so that was a very long answer, but I think, again, you switch those assumptions and you care about who you're citing. Last point, we did a panel about Nathaniel Dent's, the oratorio, the Ordering of Moses. And on that panel, it came out, major orchestras like to say, oh, this is the world premiere of this piece. And someone mentioned, I think it was Dr. Roland Carter, he said, we have to be very careful about that because a lot of these pieces, especially if you're talking early in the 20th century, had their world premiere at historically Black colleges and universities, because back then, many of them had orchestras. And so yours is not a world premiere. So all of those things become really important, and making sure that we keep the Black classical ecosystem, the Black community, so that people don't seem like anomalies and tokens, because they absolutely were not. They were a part of a broader community who understood what they were doing, cared about what they were doing, and helped them to do it. And so those are the kinds of lessons and tools that I think will continue to sustain us as we fight this iteration of this battle in the 21st century.
I mean, just absolutely. And, there's just something about, as Black people, knowing what's in our toolbox so that we may more effectively, activate and employ those tools. I actually want to go to a clip that I think pairs really well with the conversation that we're having now. What we're about to hear comes from the Black Music Symposium in 1985, held at the University of Michigan. And the man you're going to hear speaking is Mr. William Warfield. He's a African-American-based baritone and prominent artist during the Civil Rights era. He formerly served as the president of the National Association for Negro Musicians, from 84 till 1990. And also, fun fact, he was the spouse of Miss Nadine Price. Just Black history right there, great stuff. So we have that clip ready for playback.
But later for that. I contend that already in our historical past we have well defined ourselves, but are we sure of it today? Have we adequately projected that pride onto the American scene, or have we been sidetracked by various social and political trends? Blacks, even during the slavery time, brought a great deal of musical talent and heritage from Africa. There was always music, mostly group participation, but after the emancipation, formal interest into the formal classical music occurred. In the 1800s, there was a singer called Elizabeth T. Greenfield who made her debut in 1851. She was known as the Black Swan. There was also a Thomas Bowers known as the Colored Mario. The church was quite the center during these times, both for training concert singers and for sponsoring concerts. However, by mid-century, secular concerts and musical soirees were in full bloom. These concerts had soloists and small ensembles, singing family troupes and so forth. In the 1800s, by 1830, the Symphony Orchestra, Black organizations I'm talking about now, was formed in New Orleans, the Negro Philharmonic Society, over 100 members. Jazz was coming along in full blast, and the Negro spirituals in the 1800s had developed. In fact, 1867 saw the first publications of spirituals and plantation songs called Slave Songs of the United States. And by 1871, the famous Fisk Jubilee singers started a tour. Between 1865 and 1919, the minstrel troops, famous among these was James Bland and Samuel Lucas. And on the concert stage, we had famous prima donnas like Nellie Brown Mitchell, Maria Salika, Flora Batson Bergen, Rachel Walker, Matilda Ciceretta Jones. She was the most celebrated Black prima donna, known as Black Patty. During this time, there were concert instrumentalists. Blind Tom, who was a pianist, his real name was Thomas Green Bethune. Also Blind Boone.
So that clip comes from the 1985 keynote speech at the Black Music Symposium at the University of Michigan. And, just going through some of that reporting, for me, affirmed and will continue to reaffirm a lot of what you guys were just saying, like this idea, we have been here, we have been here, we have been here, and just keep, reiterating that. Dr. Tammy, you're the one introducing to these all these archives that they have at UMich. And you've had time to really sit with these recordings. I'm wondering, what have you found? What's been surprising? And what's been left with you?
Well, I think the most profound thing that I found in the 1985 symposium recordings is how really strategic how disciplined and how formulated and focused this Black music intelligentsia was. And I use those words deliberately because there is a Black music intelligentsia that begins to take shape in the late 60s, early 70s. And much of their work is not necessarily birthed out of, but it's motivated by the assassination of Dr. King. And it's motivated also by the Black campus movement that began to take shape in the late 60s, where Black students, first on PWI campuses, began to advocate for Black faculty, Black curriculum, and Black cultural spaces. But it also spread to HBCUs. And this Black campus movement really paralleled the rise of this Black music intelligentsia, which were conductors, composers, educators, historians, editors, performers, who all came together. And they had 4 distinct goals. One was to create a national pedagogy of Black music that could be integrated into K-12 and college classrooms to really establish Black music studies as a serious field of inquiry. They also set about to nurture and help birth the next generation of conductors, composers, instrumentalists, educators, and historians. They also wanted to create material culture that would support this pedagogy of Black music studies. And lastly, to create spaces that would serve as depositories of this ephemera. 1985 was them marking what had been the start of that work in 1969 when they gathered in Indiana University. It was a watershed moment because many of the major Black composers, instrumentalists, and researchers and educators all gathered there for almost 2 weeks to have this conversation, but also to mark what had been their progress. If we don't mark and have a metric of assessing how effective our work is, we are just working. And we do a lot of work. I see y'all on social media. A lot of activity. But what he was marking was the history of time and when that work had been. But those further sessions were marking what they had accomplished since 1969. And what was amazing to me is that we're still having those conversations. Some of the very same conversations. Because I labored over these archives because that was part of that work with about dismantling the mythology about Florence Price. Because what I wanted to show was there have been all of these people performing this work, and her work was performed throughout this symposium because there were all of these concerts as well as these workshops. And so what I'm saying is that looking at that history can serve as a metric for us to understand what has not been accomplished and how do we accomplish that? How do we push the needle in terms of our conversations, right? But how can we also be inspired to know that that was a generation who made a way out of no way? You know how we know that they made a way out of no way? Because they created journals, like the Black Perspective in Music, like the Black Music Research Journal. They created Black music centers. Most of them are not functional now. And part of that has to do with the fact that we didn't nurture them. We took them for granted. The Black Music Center that was at Virginia State, the Black Music Center at Indiana, repurposed. The Center for Black Music Research at Columbia, gone. The Ethnic Music Center at Howard, I could go on, gone. These were depositories for Black music ephemera from Africa to the 1980s, 90s, and in some cases, the Black Music Research Center into the 2000s. They're gone. They created organizations. They created a Black Composers Recording Series that was about documenting the music of that time. They created an infrastructure that wasn't continued into the next generation. So I'm saying this as well. If we're not thinking about who comes behind us, we're not doing effective work. You can't be successful without a successor.
Bring it back.
It's to hear this, even after reading it and even after digesting it, it's always painful to hear, and it's also a harrowing thing. And one thing that reminds me of is there's this phrase I heard somewhere, it's like history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes. And like history doesn't necessarily go in circles, but it's like a spiral, like a helix. We're gonna keep hitting those same touch points. So it is a question of what might we learn through going back in our history. And
I just want to say something really quick. She mentioned two really important journals, the Black Music Research Journal and Black Perspectives in Music. And those are still available on JSTOR and places like that. And that's the first place I go to, especially for anything connected to Black classical music, because I was working on a project about the composer Juilliard, and they had an in-depth interview with her in the Black Music Research Journal. You may see mentions in the New York Times and other places. And so, again, it's further evidence of how knowledgeable people in the Black community were and how intentional they were, the obituaries that they were writing, people who passed away. So just a +1 on that is a resource that we still have available to us that we should all have in our toolbox. It should be a go-to for when we start to work on any, intellectual project at all.
thank you.
Oral histories are important, and we must start doing our oral histories. We cannot wait. Every meeting, every collective that you come together, I would recommend that you start recording, talking to, if it's in a corner, to all the folks that come, and start documenting even what are these meetings, right? Because somebody had the foresight in 1985 to record all of those sessions. You can go back and hear some of these immortal voices speaking in real time about what they were trying to do in terms of establishing Black music it's a serious field. And not something separate, because that conference brought the classical with the popular. And that's one of the things, if I can just say, we have to do. We have to reach back to our community and make sure that our community understands that what you do is a part of who they are. Because too many young Black kids do not think that classical music is a part of our Black music making, that it's not authentic. There's too many grown people that think that. I fight with too many scholars about it who will say that that's not real Black music. When, how, where, on what day? Maybe you're performing Margaret Barnes or Bach. It's Black music because it's being interpreted through your lived experience and your physical Blackness, which shows up every time you show up, regardless. So if we're not having those conversations with our community and nurturing, it's wonderful to do this work on larger platforms, but if we're not planting seeds in our community, we're doing ourselves a disservice, because we are working in a broken infrastructure who never knew its identity. The American concert culture never knew its identity, so it was broken from the very beginning because it was trying to replicate something that had hundreds of years to establish itself. And so we have floundered for the last 200 years to figure out what we wanted to be in those concert halls. So understand, it's not just about us and Black and brown people. You're working within something that doesn't even know what it wants to be. And so, every time that it faces a hurdle, it thinks that it can pick up on your story of oppression and use it as a way of bringing us into the concert hall without nurturing us. But the nurturing starts with us. Because the moment that we are ready to ascend to those platforms, our people will follow us if we do the work and have conversation with them. If we create relationship with them. You know how I know? Because fire shut up in their bones. Brought people to the Met that probably have never been to the Met.
Right.
And now all of a sudden, the Met is very invested in Black art. But you know what? Because we will show up when our stories are told. But we have to do the work in our community. We've got to nurture. We've got to tell our story. We got to know our history. We got to show up. We got to be committed. Because that's where activism starts. It is not top down. It is grassroots. It builds up. It empowers from the bottom. So we have to go back to those ecosystems that birthed us, that nurtured us, and nurture the next generations to come in. Otherwise, what we're hoping to do will never happen. The change will never happen. Because we are dealing with generations that feel like they don't have to come to a concert hall. They can look at their phone, and they'll rather spend $500 on Beyonce. Because Beyonce resonates with them. She's connected with them. We can do that as well, but it takes time.
Excellent. Yeah. So we are at time for this session, and I just want to, Dr. Fredara, if you have any other closing remarks, anything that you want to share.
Just two quick things, really. The point about documenting, collecting oral histories, I can't emphasize that enough. And I think it's important in a day and age where everybody has a recording device in their hand to take for granted that it will always be there, right? And so really actually thinking through, how do we preserve this? Because a lot of times I hear people say, well, I put it on Facebook, I put it on Instagram. You don't own that. One thing you can change, it can be gone. You put something somewhere, nobody else knows the password, we can't get to it. So, no, I mean, like really and truly, this happened, right? So really taking that documentation and preservation piece seriously. Where do we put what is our plan? Who do we want to have access to this? And perhaps finding an institutional partner with whom to work to do that, right? I think that's really important. And two, really, I think this is beautiful. In a former life, I played viola. And part of the reason I stopped, honestly, because I went to a performing arts art school growing up in West Palm Beach, Florida, all of them. And the social isolation became too much for me. I was a little black girl, a little dark-skinned black girl with a viola in West Palm Beach, Florida. And I already went to a super white school. And then orchestra rehearsal was super white. I was exhausted, and I'm looking at all my friends go to band practice and come home happy. And then and my soul is weary, right? So I'm just being real, right? And so the piano and singing stayed, and then I kind of drifted away from viola, right? Because I think we have to take what you all are doing is so important, because I think sometimes as Black people, we overly emphasize perseverance and resilience in situations where Black people should not have to persevere or be resilient, right? The world should look different and be different for them. And so what makes me excited about being here is because this is where, as we have in previous generations, we start to address those things. And so students and teachers, right? Because if you had asked me when I was at Dreyfus School of the Arts about Black composers, I'm like, what is that? There are some, right? That's crazy, right? And so here is where we get to remember what we have done, revitalize, re-energize, so that, the next generation won't have to do this same work, won't have to have, if they have to do that, we have failed at something. They shouldn't be starting from zero. They should at least be starting from 5, 10, hopefully 20. That's how we measure the effectiveness of what we have created here. That's the standard to which we should hold ourselves in our efforts. If it's a little bit easier, if it's a lot more comfortable, if it's a lot more affirming for those who are already here on this earth coming behind us to do what they want to do, what they love to do, then our living is not in vain.
Yes, amen.
This was just a riveting 40-minute session, and it's a sad thing that we have to stop, but I would love for you to have a round of applause for my guests here today. The Black Music Scene podcast was written and produced by David Norville. Thanks to our guests today, Dr. Fredara Hadley and Dr. Tammy Kernodle, for joining us. A special thanks goes out to Jennifer Arnold, Emilio Carlo, and Joseph Matthews. The Black Orchestral Network is sponsored by the Gateways Music Festival and generously supported by the Mellon Foundation and the New York State Council on the Arts. The Black Music Scene podcast is a product of the Black Orchestral Network, where our mission is to cultivate community, lift our voices, and tell our stories. If you'd like to get involved and support the Black Orchestral Network, please visit blackorchestralnetwork.org. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.